It is July 1518. You are in the middle of Strasbourg, and you hear it. Bare feet against wet cobblestone. A woman, alone, in the middle of the square. She is moving, not gracefully, not joyfully. Her arms jerking, her neck snapping side to side, her dress soaked through with sweat. Her face, blank, absent, as if no one is home. The neighbors thought she was dancing. Must be drunk, must be mad. But she does not stop. An hour passes. She does not stop. 6 hours. She does not stop. By nightfall, her feet are bleeding, and she still cannot stop. Her name was Frau Troffea, and what started with one woman in one square on one impossible night would consume an entire city. This is the dancing plague. One woman. That is all it took. Within days, her neighbors began to move. Not by choice, not by music, just compelled. As if something invisible had reached into their bodies and pulled the strings. 3 days in, 5 more people were dancing alongside her. A week later, 34. By August, the number had exploded past 400. The streets of Strasbourg had become something out of a nightmare. Bodies everywhere, jerking, convulsing, stumbling. Eyes wide open but seeing nothing. Mouths moving but saying nothing. Drenched in sweat, collapsing, getting back up, dancing again. These people were not performing. They weren't just moving. They were screaming for mercy, begging for their limbs to stay still. But their bodies refused to obey. Imagine watching your mother stagger into the square, her face twisted, not in joy, not in madness, but in pure, silent agony. Her feet moving against her will, her eyes finding yours for just a moment, and then looking away, because she cannot stop. Exhaustion wasn't an option. Hunger wasn't a distraction. Pain meant nothing. People began to drop. Heart attacks, strokes, complete physical collapse. At the peak, chronicles report 15 people dying every single day. This was no longer strange. This was no longer gossip. Strasbourg had a crisis on its hands. The city council was desperate. They had no playbook for this. Nothing in history had prepared them for 400 people convulsing in the streets with no end in sight. So they did what any desperate authority does. They turned to the experts. The physicians of Strasbourg examined the dancers and came back with a diagnosis. They called it hot blood. The belief was rooted in medieval medicine, the idea that the body runs on 4 fluids that must stay in balance. And in these dancers, something had tipped. Their blood had overheated, they said, literally cooking the brain from the inside and sending the body into this endless, uncontrollable frenzy. Now here is where it gets truly remarkable. Because once you accept that diagnosis, that the body is overheating, the treatment that follows actually makes a kind of twisted internal logic. If the fever is driving the movement, then perhaps the only way out is through. Let the body exhaust itself completely. Burn it out. So the council built a stage. They opened the guild halls. They hired professional musicians, drummers, pipers, and they hired strongmen whose only job was to hold the collapsing dancers upright so their feet never stopped moving. They genuinely believed this would work. It did not. What they had actually done was turn a crisis into a spectacle. The music carried through the streets, and the people who were already on the edge, starving, grieving, terrified, they heard it. And one by one, they came, and they joined. The stage became a slaughterhouse of rhythm. The stage and music had failed. The physicians and science had failed. And people were still dying. The counselors had listened to the Guild of Physicians, who declared the dance to be a natural disease coming from overheated blood. That was their best explanation. That was the full extent of what medicine could offer in 1518. And it had made everything worse. At this point, the council had exhausted every rational option they had. And when rational options run out in 1518, there is really only one place left to turn: God. But not God in the gentle or comforting sense. God in the wrathful and punishing sense. Because a specific name had started circulating through the streets of Strasbourg by now, spoken quietly and nervously, the way you speak a name you are genuinely afraid of. Saint Vitus. The belief around Saint Vitus was very particular. It was said that this saint had the power to curse the sinful with an endless and inescapable dance as divine punishment. And when the people of Strasbourg looked around at what was happening in their streets, that explanation did not seem far-fetched at all. It seemed obvious. So the entire logic of the response shifted overnight. The council banned music across the city. Gambling houses were closed and brothels were shuttered. Every possible source of sin was eliminated. And the dancers themselves were no longer being seen as patients. They were sinners now. And sinners needed a priest, not a physician. The worst afflicted were gathered and sent on a 3-day journey to the shrine of Saint Vitus in Saverne, a town 30 miles outside Strasbourg. And what happened there is one of the more remarkable details of this entire story. The priests placed the afflicted underneath a wooden carving of Vitus. They put small crosses in their hands and red shoes on their feet. On the soles and tops of these shoes, they sprinkled holy water and painted crosses of consecrated oil. The ritual was carried out in an atmosphere thick with incense and Latin incantations. And then, it stopped. Whether it was the isolation from the city, the exhaustion finally breaking the body past its limit, or the psychological weight of the ritual itself, we cannot say for certain. But the dancing plague of Strasbourg came to an end somewhere in that shrine in Saverne, as suddenly and as mysteriously as it had begun. So the dancing had stopped. But the question had not. What exactly had just happened in Strasbourg? When modern historians began digging into this event centuries later, one theory kept surfacing, and on the surface it sounds genuinely compelling. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 were starving. They were eating whatever they could get. And one of the most common foods available to the poor was rye bread. Cheap, accessible, and filling enough to survive on. But rye has a problem. When rye grows in damp conditions, it becomes vulnerable to a toxic mold called ergot. Ergot is not a minor irritant. It is a powerful, mind-altering fungus that causes convulsions, twitching, jerking, and vivid hallucinations. Historically, this condition was so common and so terrifying that medieval communities gave it its own name, St. Anthony's fire. The main psychoactive compound in ergot, ergotamine, is structurally related to LSD. It is, in fact, the very substance from which LSD was originally synthesized in the 20th century. So the theory builds like this: a bad harvest, wet summer conditions, contaminated grain ground into flour. The poor of Strasbourg bake their bread from infected rye without knowing it. They eat it, and then their bodies begin to move in ways they cannot control and cannot stop. It is a neat explanation. It is a scientific explanation. And for a long time, many people found it convincing. But there are serious problems with it. The first problem is biological. Ergot does not just cause convulsions and hallucinations. It also severely restricts blood flow to the extremities. The hands go numb. The feet go cold. Someone genuinely poisoned by ergot would not be physically capable of dancing for several consecutive days. Their limbs simply would not cooperate. The very symptom the theory depends on, sustained, prolonged, relentless movement, is physically incompatible with what ergot actually does to a human body. The second problem is the pattern of infection. If contaminated bread was the cause, you would expect entire households to collapse together. Families sharing the same loaf, the same meal, going down at the same time. But that is not what the records show. The plague moved through the city in a scattered, individual pattern. One person here, another there. Not households, not families, individuals. And the third problem is geographic. Similar outbreaks of dancing mania had been recorded across Europe for centuries, in regions where rye was not even a staple food. If ergot was the answer, it should not keep appearing in places where the explanation cannot apply. The ergot theory, as satisfying as it sounds, does not hold up under scrutiny. So if it was not the bread, then what was it? We are left with the most uncomfortable explanation of all: the human mind. The most widely accepted theory today comes from medical historian John Waller, who argued across several papers that the dancing plague was a form of mass psychogenic disorder, where physical symptoms spread through a community without any shared infectious or toxic cause. And to understand why Waller finds this so convincing, you have to understand what Strasbourg actually looked like in 1518. The people of Strasbourg were experiencing acute distress after a succession of terrible harvests, the highest grain prices in over a generation, the arrival of syphilis, and the return of old killers like leprosy and plague. Even by the grueling standards of the Middle Ages, these were bitterly harsh years. These were not people living with manageable stress. These were people who had been ground down, season after season, with no relief in sight. And they were doing all of this inside a culture that genuinely believed in divine punishment. They believed a saint could reach down and seize your body as payment for your sins. The cultural script was already there. A person could be seized by a dancing affliction, and others could follow. Waller's argument is that Frau Troffea, under enormous stress from hunger, illness, and the pressures of late medieval life, entered a state that her neighbors understood through the St. Vitus story. And once that first person crossed that line, once the community saw it happen with their own eyes, the belief made it real for everyone else too. One by one, body by body. Now there is one other voice worth mentioning here. A physician and alchemist named Paracelsus, who visited Strasbourg several years after the plague and became fascinated by what had happened. In Paracelsus's view, Frau Troffea's dancing was a deliberate ploy to embarrass her husband. He wrote that, in order to make the deception as perfect as possible and really give the impression of illness, she hopped and sang, which was all most distasteful to her husband. And upon seeing the success of this trick, he claimed, other women began dancing to annoy their husbands too. Most historians today do not take this view seriously. But it is worth noting because it is one of the earliest attempts to place the cause of this event not in heaven or in the blood, but in the interior life of a woman who may simply have had no other way to resist. By September 1518, it was over. The dancers had either collapsed for the last time or slowly, quietly, returned to themselves. The streets of Strasbourg went still, and what had consumed an entire city for nearly 2 months faded into the background noise of history. Another strange thing that happened, in another strange time, to people we tell ourselves were different from us. But were they? We still do not have a definitive answer to what happened in Strasbourg. The ergot theory does not hold up. The St. Vitus explanation belongs to its era. And even mass psychogenic illness, as convincing as Waller makes it sound, leaves questions that science cannot fully close. What we do know is this: 400 people lost control of their own bodies. A city made rational decisions that made everything worse. And the most powerful cure turned out to be not medicine or music, but a ritual. a story the mind could finally accept as an ending. That should give us pause, because we live in a world with its own version of Strasbourg. Rising anxiety, a population that is exhausted and overstimulated and quietly desperate, and systems of belief, digital ones now, that can move through a population faster than any plague in 1518 could have dreamed of. We like to think we are modern, rational, immune, but the body still responds to fear. The mind still follows what it believes. And a crowd can still move in one direction without anyone choosing to lead it. We are all just one step away from a dance we cannot stop. Follow us for more, because the past was never as simple as it seems.